Well, thanks so much for joining, everyone. This session covers work in progress, so I really appreciate any input or comments you may wish to share. We have some exciting research on artificial intelligence coming up after my presentation, so I've decided to focus on something more mundane, the issue of regulatory sandboxes. Now, the starting point of my research is simple. At the end of May 2020, so that's basically a month ago, Australia finally adopted the revised FinTech Sandbox regulations. The new regime is informally labeled Enhanced Regulatory Sandbox or simply Enhanced Sandbox, and it becomes operational on the 1st of September this year, and is expected, as far as I can tell, to bring much joy and happiness to the domestic FinTech sector. Well, at least this is how I interpret the words of the FinTech minister. You can see, of our FinTech minister, you can see on the slide. Now, the underlying rationale for this reform is basically to revise the existing sandbox initiative that has so far proven largely unsuccessful. This is the latest progress report of ASIC's Innovation Hub that I have found. For some reason, they disappeared from the ASIC website at some point, but frankly, not much has changed. For over almost 4 years of operation, the regulatory sandbox has attracted only 7 firms. And on top of that, I think it's fair to say it earned a certain level of notoriety among a number of academics who have been trying to figure out the secret of this poor outcome. Perhaps due to low numbers, the most recent statistics found in ASIC's annual report for the years 2018-2019 do not even include the sandbox numbers, as you can see. Here's a brief timeline of Australia's regulatory sandbox, which is managed by ASIC, both under the old and the new regimes. It is likely that ASIC will release new guidance in addition to the regulations, but my research is based on the materials that are available right now. You may think, okay, I get it. So just 7 firms over 3.5 years, why would we even care about this? After all, Australia's sandbox is not the only one with few participants. Not every sandbox can be expected to replicate the success we have seen in the UK or Hong Kong sandboxes, which have accepted over 100 fintechs each. Well, 2 reasons really here. First is that ASIC Sandbox was amongst the world's first. It was launched in 2016 alongside the sandboxes from the UK, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And now all of the first movers are revising their approaches, and all are doing so in different ways. And second, ASIC designed its sandbox very differently. There is no application process and no screening of prospective applicants. And this design has obviously attracted a lot of attention, regardless of the number of participants. Although the low numbers have led some commentators to conclude, understandably, that perhaps this unique design is to blame. So just a quick outline. I'll start with describing the familiar and incredibly confusing academic narrative on regulatory sandboxes, then just a few words about the enhanced sandbox, and finally some interim conclusions. The academic literature considers regulatory sandboxes as a standalone type of regulatory strategy for fintech, sharing a number of common features. These can be briefly summarized as follows. First, they create a controlled and supervised environment, allowing innovative businesses to test their business model. Second, the regulatory environment is restricted in a number of ways, such as the threshold limits or maximum time during which you can test the innovation. And third, the relevant tests are carried out with the involvement of real consumers, rather than, say, using dummy data. The problem here is that similarities found in academic literature essentially reiterate the regulatory narrative, that is, description provided by the regulators themselves, who are, for obvious reasons, the most interested party for promoting sandboxes in the first place. And as such descriptions are not very helpful. So are sandboxes really that different from other regulatory practices? In the literature, they have been described as, I quote, more forward-looking, more structured, more experimental, whatever that means, compared to related initiatives like pilots or licensing waivers. And frankly, this separation is not very persuasive, and the difference is often almost ethereal. For example, pilot and waiver programs can be very comprehensive at times and also well structured. So in a sense, regulatory sandboxes have surprisingly little personality of their own. They just mimic other regulatory approaches to fintech. And what seems to matter most in this context is the overall objective of promoting innovation. But if that provisional conclusion is true, then the whole discussion about regulatory sandboxes may ultimately turn on whether the regulator positions itself as pro-innovation or not. In other words, if the objective alone is determinative, then the old regulatory initiatives can be rebranded as old wine in new bottle, when the only thing that changes really is the regulatory narrative. So to sum up, analysis of regulatory sandbox looking at the underlying tools is not determinative, whereas analysis based on the underlying objectives is not helpful either. Okay, so the literature is a mess. To make matters worse, Australia's sandbox model does not neatly fit in those discussions. In its Regulatory Guide 257, ASIC defines a sandbox as a combination of three different tools, all offering a licensing waiver: statutory exemptions under the Corporations Act and NCCP Act, the fintech licensing exemption, and also individual relief granted by ASIC in the form of tailored licensing exemptions. So in simple terms, all this time, ASIC has been formally trying to say that its sandbox is not limited to the class waiver and that the individual exemptions that can be granted by ASIC are also elements of some grander sandbox. Well, naturally, that seems quite attractive on paper. After all, almost all sandboxes today follow the same authorization-based model where you need to apply to the regulator first. The problem here, of course, is that individual relief of the kind described by ASIC had been offered by it long before the emergence of the sandbox narrative. And the remaining two elements of the regulatory sandbox, the statutory exemption and the fintech licensing exemption, follow a completely different model. They don't involve any screening of applicants, but they apply differently. The former do not have any limitation as to the duration, whereas the latter, the fintech licensing exemption, is available to eligible parties only for a limited time, up to 12 months. So did ASIC's approach really work? Well, not really. Despite ASIC's broad definition of the sandbox concept, the academic literature has so far focused almost entirely on the second element, the fintech licensing exemption, in an attempt to explain it as a sandbox. And it has proven quite difficult given the specific features of this exemption. For example, the non-authorization model, where you don't need to apply, is incompatible with the common presumption that in order to be admitted to a sandbox, a firm must offer something innovative. Also, some commentators have argued that the essential characteristics of a sandbox are an interactive regulatory environment, or a highly participatory dialogue, or flexibility for innovative businesses. Well, there's none of that really. There's very little interactivity, as I'll show later, and the fintech licensing exemption is very prescriptive, based on a set of fixed and non-negotiable parameters. As a result, some authors have suggested that the licensing exemption is inconsistent with the logic that underpins the sandbox approach, and others got so confused that after spending the whole paper analyzing the exemption as a sandbox, ended up concluding that it's not the sandbox to begin with. So there are three conclusions stemming from the above discussion, and all of which are challenged in my paper. Well, the first one is that ASIC's characterization is determinative. My paper argues that retaining the current sandbox three-piece characterization is unnecessary, unjustified, and at this point, downright confusing for the public and for the regulators. Well, first, it can be relatively simple to address regulatory initiative in sandbox terminology. Besides, the documentary history analysis suggests that the three-part design was essentially a result of a last-minute change that did not match the original proposal to establish the sandbox exemption. Second, the approach didn't really work in academia. The academic discourse focuses almost exclusively on the licensing exemption. Third, according to ASIC itself, the new regulations and the fintech minister, they all use the language of the fintech sandbox exclusively applying it to the licensing exemption. And perhaps most importantly, the expectation that ASIC's sandbox would lead the world or leapfrog what other jurisdictions are doing didn't really materialize today. So by overstating the scope of the sandbox, ASIC may be doing a disservice to its own regulatory framework, since the low numbers in the licensing exemption can be seen as a failure of the sandbox approach, broadly interpreted as a whole. The second conclusion is that the sandbox concept is reasonably well understood. Well, I argue that as a concept, it's not adequately theorized at all and has not been consistently applied. And this is quite important for three reasons. Well, first, the scope of the sandbox concept keeps expanding, particularly in the last 2 years when more and more sandbox concepts are beginning to emerge, such as the new Sandbox Express in Singapore or the Global Financial Innovation Networks Sandbox. So this process I call sandboxification is gaining speed and is likely to continue in a post-COVID world. Now, second, only a conceptual approach can help to understand and reconcile the rationale of those regulators in certain jurisdictions that completely reject the idea of a sandbox. This is relevant for Germany and France, for example. So what exactly did the German and French regulators reject? Could it be that the relevant risks are misinterpreted and are more relevant only for some sandbox models rather than the others? And third, a conceptual approach is really the missing link between the early scholarship on regulatory sandboxes and the more recent writings aiming to assess the efficiency of the fintech sandbox. For example, a recent publication provocatively argues that sandboxes are not in fact that useful in the first place and that innovation hubs do all the work. So in my paper, I propose several approaches to building the sandbox concept and analyze the underlying issues. For example, if a sandbox is time limited, then the Swiss initiative falls out, or if we stress the importance of interactivity or dialogue between the regulators and the regulated, then Australia's licensing exemption is failing the test as well. And the third conclusion is, which follows from the other two, is that Australia has a single fintech sandbox, the one associated with ASIC and its regulatory guidance. It's firmly grounded in the academic and professional literature, which is perhaps unsurprising. Well, I argue that if we apply the concept consistently, then the restricted ADI regime introduced by APRA in 2018 qualifies as a regulatory sandbox, despite being labeled as such, and is perhaps even better aligned with the concept with the mainstream authorization-based sandbox model. On the slide, you can see a quick comparison between the original public consultation on the concept of regulatory sandbox, the current regime in the middle, and the enhanced regime on the right-hand side. You can see that the duration has increased quite a bit, with a double increase over the current duration and at 4 times the increase compared to the initial consultation, and it's much broader today. Well, the real big issue I have with this concept at this point is the much broader grounds for the early termination, which is uncharacteristic for the non-authorization sandbox model. In fact, it's very hard to justify. Strictly speaking, fintech firms relying on the fintech licensing exemption may find themselves in a less advantageous position compared to an authorization sandbox. After all, elsewhere in the world, firms that have passed the vetting process do not face the risk of exclusion from the sandbox on similar grounds. In contrast, fintech firms that are using ASIC's fintech licensing exemption need to bear the risks that their sandbox privileges may be withdrawn at any time due to failure to comply with those parameters that are not even part of the eligibility criteria and are not being assessed ex ante. And those parameters, I need to stress, include business not being innovative or offering something that is not very new. And on this slide, there's a quick comparison of the ASIC and APRA sandboxes. I call them both. And you can see that APRA is presumably doing a better job at being, the restricted ADI regime is doing a better job at being a sandbox with its application-based process and much higher level of interactivity with monthly reporting obligations and no ex-post test of innovativeness. And since I'm running out of time, and I think I'm on time here, I'm jumping to the indicative conclusions, which is my final slide essentially. Thanks for the reminder, Rob. So the starting point is, how many jurisdictions have followed Australia's sandbox model? As far as I can tell, a whopping zero. So far, different commentators have summarily rejected the Australian approach as an idea that should be exported to other jurisdictions, such as Alan, who considers the approaches for US sandbox. And the second point is that ASIC's broad definition of a sandbox is part of a bigger problem with which all regulators engage, a proper marketing of their pro-innovative culture, or put it simply, lack of common taxonomy. And in fact, the new enhanced sandbox marketed in Australia is much closer to the full-fledged authorization model in a sense, that of the kind we can see in the UK, for example, in particular due to the quite weird early termination grounds that are uncharacteristic for hands-off and non-authorization based regulatory sandboxes, and that can hardly be justified as such. The third point is that I'm considering the need for alignment, and this is something I'm working on right now, between the ASIC and APRA sandboxes. It's quite important, quite interesting, given the current the recent expansion of the enhanced regulatory sandbox by ASIC. Under the current regime, the dual regulation by ASIC and APRA is quite unlikely, given the very narrow scope and the different timeline and such. But now we have 2-year sandboxes by both regulators, and the potential for overlaps is much higher. The fourth point is, and it's quite disturbing for me personally, is there seems to be very little evidence that ASIC sandbox was designed in response to a specific legal challenge. So one may argue that the whole point of a sandbox is to preempt problems, not wait for those. And so in a sense, the sandbox is a solution waiting for a problem. But this argument doesn't really work in the context of Australia. The entire design of the ASIC sandbox is non-interactive. And that means that it is based on ex-ante assessment by the regulator of potential use cases. And there are 2 explanations for the weak performance. First, the simple one is that the analysis was incorrect, in which case we're missing an explanation on how restrictions have been determined and whether they're going to be effective. The second explanation is that the restrictions were chosen simply to minimize the risks, in which case the issues that I'm finishing, Rob. In which case, the issues in ASIC's regional sandbox are self-reinforcing. So if the objective is to minimize risks, you select activities that are narrow and are well understood. But this means that the regulator has little or no interest in having some kind of dialogue in the first place. And given all these issues and given the recent changes in the enhanced sandbox, I argue in favor of finally switching to the authorization model. And this brings me to the end. Here is some additional research if you're interested. Thank you very much.